have the, oh wow, you didn't circle the veto, friends, not cool. Which one you veto on off?
Middle one.
Middle one, so the second one, right?
Yeah.
Okay, affirmative?
The last motion.
All right, so we are debating first one. All right, on the motion that we should replace progressive income tax system with a progressive zakat system, let's welcome the first affirmative speaker. Here, here.
This is volume fine. Inequality is the hydra of our time. With every inch of progress we gain and every head we cut out, more heads grow in its place. This is because of stagnation, unfettered greed, and structural barriers to growth. We would suggest the current income tax system is insufficient in dealing with these problems, and in response, we prefer a model of zakat wherein the broad difference or the general difference will be, it is not just the income itself that will be taxed, but the wealth you own. So these are things like land, stocks you own, general assets. What we have to clarify in this debate is, judge this debate on three standards. First is whether or not the state has a right to do this. Second, whether or not it helps the economically vulnerable better than the current system. And third, it promotes a better economy overall. So the debate should be fairly obvious. I'm going to do a few things in my speech. Firstly, I'm going to highlight what the problem is that we're dealing with, why it continues to be a problem even with the current tax system. Second, I'm going to explain why this specific model is principally justifiable for the state to enact. Second, the second thing I'm going to talk about is why income tax itself is insufficient. And lastly, why we make a more productive general economy on our side of the house. So firstly, let's look at the problem. The biggest problem is simple. The wealthy, the rich, the upper middle class hoard assets that are barely used. So you have tracts of land, houses that end up unused. This is likely to be the case, for example, for a lot of white areas in the United States, or even the haciendas in the Philippines, right? This is how, or this is likely the way in which they store the wealth that they have. To a lot of individuals, this may seem a lot more economically viable than storing them, for example, in banks, because the assets, when you store them and when you hoard them, they gain value. Why is this problematic? This allows massive inequalities not only to persist, but to grow beyond repair with the current system. Because individuals can only use so much wealth, right? To a large degree, when the extremely rich have their wealth, it's incredibly difficult to manage and make all that wealth productive. Secondly, the rich own land and assets that the poor don't have access to, and the fact that they hold them and leave them idle makes the value of these much, much higher. So for example, if you hold land as a wealthy individual, refuse to use it, that makes land in general scarcer and drives those prices up. This is important because it means that investing in hospitals, infrastructure, housing for the poor are a lot less inefficient because it is more expensive, right? When it's unused, the price of the land generally increases. But more than that, people own large shares in companies, but the poor systematically are unable to access the growth of wealth in these shares, right? We would suggest the harms are twofold. One, it's a general harm of inequality, but two, allowing them to hold these assets that are owned means that they're less accessible to other individuals because of the analysis I just gave you. So one, why is this principally justifiable? We would suggest that the general principle of income tax, to which they should agree with, because their comparative is also like regular income tax, is the reason why the state can tax is twofold. One is because there's a value in reducing inequality, and two, it is a recognition that society and the state in general has contributed and is a necessary prerequisite for you to have generated that income, right? Protecting the market, creating roads where your goods can go to land are all reasons, are all things the state has done necessarily, which led to your capacity to generate that income. We would suggest that the principle applies here to a greater degree to wealth in general and assets in general. We would suggest it takes a lot more state resources to protect your idle land, for example, or your idle buildings, your mansions, and idle structures that people have to invest on security for to maintain these, right? We would suggest the principle at minimum applies to the exact same degree or applies to a greater degree on our side of the house. So what am I going to say in the next part? I'm going to explain to you why the current level of income tax is insufficient. Few reasons why. First, in terms of sheer amounts, we would suggest it's less than our side because Like we are taxing income as well, but in addition to that, we're also taxing all of the assets. So just pure math, it's more on our side of the house. Second, we think it's insufficient because if you're taxing income tax and investing on infrastructure and projects, while the price of primary commodities like land increases, that becomes insufficient because even though you take large amounts of wealth, since the land increases, the amount or the cost of things like infrastructure, hospitals, schooling, welfare, all goes up. We would suggest the best way to make this efficient is to stop the growth of or the rising price on these assets, right? But the second thing we would suggest is the reason why income tax will be larger in amounts is because assets grow, whereas income is absolute amounts and even is prone to things like inflation, right? But what do we think the state can do when it takes these assets? So one is very big, on a very simple level, it can liquidate these for projects. We think in the first level, there's just more amounts of wealth you can use to fund projects. But secondly, you can take these land, the land themselves, and use them for hospitals, infrastructure, make them more productive land, which means that the prices of these things drive down, right? You have, in general, more resources in our side of the house that are prone to multiplier effects. But secondly, it targets the problem that we can't fix in the status quo, which is like hoarding, right? So for example, it's not just hoarding land, it's also hoarding money, right? When you hoard money in a bank, when you hoard land, when you hoard houses and you don't use them, all of those values go up. It means poor individuals have lower purchasing power, right? It means they have less access to housing because housing is less affordable, less access to all these infrastructural projects because all of those are built on tracts of land, which means that inequality on their side of the house is unlikely to be solved. It is better solved in our side of the house. We take the land and we make it more productive on our side of the house. But the last thing I want to say, why we make a more productive economy in general. The status quo has huge amounts of unused land and wealth like general assets, right? This means that these are land assets, wealth, not being used in productive ways that can employ individuals, use all factors of production to maximize the productivity, right? This means, for example, getting more goods, more efficient trade, getting more employment. Why is this unlikely to be the case? Because, for example, let's look at the individuals who be impacted by this policy. If it's the upper middle class who will likely be taxed, they hoard their resources or save up their resources because they're afraid of losing out economically. There are fears of their economic insecurity that mean they're likely to save this land in the long term. For the ultra rich, it is just practically hard to maximize all of the wealth you have when you have it in exorbitantly large amounts, right? The harm is you don't maximize all of the resources in the state. You have land that is uninhabited, cash not invested to create jobs, make businesses, etc. On the comparative, what our side does, or in our side, we will use, the individuals will know that yearly, at the end of the year, this will be taxed. How are they likely to respond? One, this means that to them, they will be forced to maximize the value of these assets and grow them because they know that some of it will be taken away at the end. What are the benefits of this? One, in general, you just stimulate the economy, but all of the subsequent actions of investing more, using the land, creating, hospitals, etc., are all subsequent consequences that are taxable by the state. So even tax revenue in general is increased. These are all things that will go to the welfare, the funding. They're all things that they value in this debate as well. What did we prove, or what did I prove from first affirmative? One, the current problem of inequality is not solved sufficiently by the current income tax model. Two, why we solve that better on our side of the house. And three, why we make generally a more productive economy. This is why we're very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Let's welcome the first negative. Here.
Here.
The first affirmative ignored a pretty important part of this topic and the definition of a zakat, because they ignored the direction and use of this tax which is it is directed exclusively towards social welfare programs and to help the poor. This was not a debate about whether or not we should tax assets, because that was also something the negative team could support. This was a debate about whether we adopted this specific kind of taxation system, and that was not something the first negative tried to justify. Let's talk firstly then in rebuttal about the main benefit that the affirmative claim, which is you expand the tax base to all assets, and then I'm going to talk substantively firstly about why this model is counter to the principles of justified progressive taxation, and then secondly why this leads to worse outcomes for poorer individuals and society more broadly. Then on rebuttal, they say that the main benefit of a zakat is that the current tax base is insufficient to provide all of the services that are required in society, and that this model expands it to all assets. Firstly, most of those assets are already generally taxed, just in a less blunt way. So most countries have quite high land taxes, and they are almost exclusively higher than income taxes. So if you implemented this model, the tax on those land assets would go down, because you would equalize probably to the lowest common denominator, or at least to an average of those tax rates, which means that you would be taxing those assets less. But also, we have things like high capital gains taxes when the increase in the real value of securities such as shares goes up, or on all other assets when they become more valuable to you, you pay extensive taxation on those things. But secondly, on the negative team, if we do not currently tax those assets, we can also support taxing those assets, the same ones the affirmative claims are currently outside the realm of the tax net, just not with a blunt tax system like they have to propose of taxing them at a set percentage of all of those assets. Let's note that this change by the affirmative team is going to require a very high amount of political capital to justify, and we are therefore able to make other changes. If there are any assets that are currently outside the net that we want to include, we will expand it to include them. Thirdly, the zakat is structurally likely and necessarily has to be at a lower rate than if we set the taxes on assets independently from each different kind of asset, but also if we set it independently from things like income tax. Because in order now to justify increasing the tax that wealthy individuals are paying on their real property and on their land, you also have to equally argue for a similar or the same increase in everyone's income tax that they are paying. And that makes it much harder to justify that, because the political argument is one and the same. But also, it's structurally going to have to be set at a low rate, because when they wanted to focus on real property assets, you can't tax someone 20% of the value of their house every year, because in 5 years they run out of money. You therefore have to set it at a structurally low rate. That is a problem, because that rate also determines how much income tax they're paying, and that money continues to get paid each year, but you're catching less of it than you could otherwise, because you're tying the income tax rate you can charge progressively to the amount you can feasibly charge on land, and that means it is likely to be lower. First argument in substantive is why this is counter to the principles of progressive taxation. Firstly, because it directs the money exclusively to the poor, and that is not something that is how our progressive taxation system should work. Because the principle or justification for progressive taxation is not just that we redistribute money down to people who are less privileged. It is to evaluate the benefit that individuals are receiving from society and their capacity to contribute back to society, and then calculate what they owe. That does not justify taxing their assets generally. It justifies taxing income and benefits as they receive it. So for example, money that hits their bank account, the capital gains tax, and the increase in money that they are able to access, because that indicates the extent of the moral claim by the state upon their income, because it indicates the justification for taking that property away from them, that the state is owed that money. But it also reflects how much effort the individual has put into attaining that money. The example of property taxes generally being higher than income taxes indicates that we tax that because we think people put more work into earning their income than they do into, for example, inheriting property. But secondly, and specifically on taxing all assets, that is particularly unjust, because the market value of assets, or however they would evaluate this valuation, does not reflect the benefit that individuals are receiving from those assets. So for example, if you inherited a very highly valued home because it was in a very wealthy area, but you were very cash poor, the only benefit you're getting of that house is accommodation, which you could equally receive if you lived in a poorer area where the value of the house would be lower, and therefore the zakat that you would have to pay would be lower. but you probably do not have the capacity to necessarily sell that house. Maybe you're emotionally tied to it because it's your family home. But importantly, the benefit you're receiving does not justify taking away a higher amount of money from you. But secondly, it's important to be able to tax assets differentially based on the kinds of asset that they are. This affirmative team has to defend taxing all kinds of assets equally, and in fact, they try to claim that as a benefit at first affirmative. The reason you have to be able to tax assets differentially is because holding different kinds of assets affects society differently, and therefore the burden you're imposing on society or the moral claim that the state has to you to taking your money based on you holding those assets varies. So for example, holding financial securities is very different to holding money in your bank account, because at the point at which you're holding financial securities, you're having an impact on the market and the amount of wealth that other people have, whereas if it's just sitting in your bank account, you don't have that impact. Let's note then that it is principally unjustified to tax all assets equally and to tax income and assets equally, because assets do not measure the amount of benefit you are getting from them and therefore do not affect the moral claim the state has to that money. Secondly, why is this worse for poorer individuals? Firstly, it limits the potential assistance from the state to social welfare only, and that is the part of the info slide this affirmative team apparently did not bother to read. We think it is important that they receive support and benefits from the state that cannot be means tested and therefore necessarily are not social welfare. So for example, things like public transport or public infrastructure like roads, obviously everyone uses and therefore cannot qualify as giving money to the poor or giving money in the form of social welfare, but those things are incredibly important to poor people in order to, for example, be able to access employment. Also things like the defense budget, the budget for arts, things like research and medical research or academia generally, things like stimulus packages in times of economic disadvantage, all of which could never be characterized by this affirmative team or by a government as social welfare, are things that are necessary both for society to run, but also for poorer people within society to have stable lives. Because at the point at which you can't give stimulus packages, poorer people are less likely to be able to access employment because there is likely to be less jobs going. That hurts them materially, but it is not a direct form of social welfare in that it is not given to them because they are more disadvantaged. But there are also broader social harms of this limitation, because this cut is an incredibly blunt way of collecting tax revenue. There are a large number of incentives or deterrents that it's important the government is able to provide in order to manipulate or change people's behavior that they cannot do under this system because there's a set percentage of their income and their assets. So for example, things like encouraging people to donate to charity, but more importantly, socially useful things like forms of middle class welfare, like incentivizing people to take out private health insurance or incentivizing them to send their kids to private schools. Those things obviously are not social welfare because they exclusively include rich people, but they are a benefit to less privileged people because they lower the burden on the public healthcare system, the public education system. When you incentivize richer people to pay for their own child's education or healthcare, that helps those people, but it is not a social welfare system, and therefore there is less money available to spend on those sorts of things because all of this progressive tax has to go towards those outcomes. But secondly, it reduces the money available to services to the poor more generally. As I said earlier, this has to be set at a low rate. An additional reason for that is that the way that we politically justify high progressive taxation is the idea that it benefits everyone in society. Now, you are explicitly and exclusively directing this money to a class of people that does not include the person paying the tax, and therefore it is harder to get them to vote for higher tax rates or to get them to pay those things. Taxing assets is good. Taxing assets bluntly and at the same rate as income tax is bad, and that is what this affirmative team had to defend.
Thank you very much for that speech. Second affirmative speaker, please.
I'm honestly quite confused with the stance coming from Sydney. Because on one end, they claim that our policy will not have the political capital to have high tax rates for assets and goods because people are afraid of giving up their taxes, and therefore the likely scenario is it's going to be very low. But in the same breath, they say that they are perfectly willing to have an opposition, high taxes for like high capital gains taxes, for instance, high estate taxes that exist. If it is so hard politically for us to be able to win this, first of all, I think the motion kind of assumes that we are able to tax it in the same way progressive income tax does. But even if it is not, we think that the counter policies coming from opposition or negative this debate would mean that there's also the same amount of political capital to make sure that our income tax is the same rate, or sorry, the asset tax is the same rate as everything else. So we're uncertain how that criticism of the policy really works. I'll answer a few questions in my speech. First, are the current taxes enough? Because that is the first clash that they put on our model. They say there are things, high capital gains tax, for instance, there's high inheritance tax, high estate tax. Why is this insufficient? And you have to note the difference of high capital tax versus our policy. Because our policy is that you are taxing the ownership of that estate or ownership of these assets to begin with, which means that even if you don't transfer that asset to someone else or you don't die and a family member gets it, you're constantly taxed. That is why the argument saying that high estate taxes are enough doesn't really work, because that relies on the time when wealth is transferred between people, which we have argued coming from first, that it is very unlikely for them to be able to do so. One, because rich people want to hoard their money, and because if they start investing their money or giving it away, it is far more likely to be a risk that they don't want to take to begin with. So we are uncertain why they will, this policy is enough. But secondly, even if we're able to tax the same amount of money, we would suggest we can't tax the physical assets, which zakat is able to do. So these things like acquiring pieces of land that you necessarily have. And the difference of assets and why it's important is because you can profit over these assets to begin with, which means that things like building housing projects, for instance, or building educational systems or hospitals within these land areas, or the amount of cash that we have allows us to make more money, because compared to their said house, we have the physical monetary value that exists to begin with. So we don't think that their counter model of the current taxes are enough. But then they said taxes will be lower because we will be taxing people a lot, and therefore little by little, the rich individuals in society will earn less. Why do we think that this is problematic? First, because the likely scenario is rich people wouldn't allow themselves to be poor, right? So the likely scenario is they're going to start investing the money they have. But the impetus only comes when they have the fear of their money being taxed, and therefore they're earning less money in the long run. That is why they're far more likely to use some money right now to make profitable gains. But secondly, we say, even if to an extent the absolute value of tax we can tax as individuals is less, the ability of assets to make money also allows you to compensate for that. So for instance, the fact that you're able to own land, for instance, which starts increasing in value, allows them to make money in comparison to their house, we're not able to use some money to begin with. There was no response coming from them about the structural problems created by only taxing income, which is that if you're able to hoard assets, the prices of assets and the ability for other people in society to access these assets is far more unlikely under their set of house. But then they said, the problem with this is that we can't tax different assets on an equal rate. I'm uncertain, one, why the amount of taxes will be taxed on an equal rate, because assets are already valued on the basis of your individual preference or the individual interest to you. So yes, the value of having a financial bonds is different from the value of having it in a bank. But the value of it in assets, if it's a financial bond, is greater than the value of it having the money in the bank. So you don't understand why they can't allow it to access it properly already under their set house. We suggest that they already properly discriminate on the basis of the market value. If you're problematizing things like sentimental value of the families, we really don't care about that coming from affirmative bench, because we would suggest that the sentimental value to have your house is nothing compared to the fact that the vast majority of individuals right now are unable to live, right? The fact that they don't have a house, the fact that they can't afford welfare and all of these things. I'm sorry, but I don't think it's an important value in today's debate. The last thing they said was the problem with their model is that it only goes to social welfare projects. We would suggest, number one, that social welfare doesn't necessarily only mean you giving dole-outs to the poor, right? Social welfare can be a general term of the entire welfare of society. So I think it's an unfair interpretation coming from them to say that it's not a problem. But secondly, I will engage it and say why even if social welfare is the only thing we give is social welfare, why is it a good thing? Because if you look at the harms that they have, they're very, very minuscule, right? The first problem is you prevent the ability of the state
to incentivize middle-class individuals to invest in privatized healthcare, for instance, invest in privatized education. I'm uncertain why this is an absolute value in this debate. We would prefer them to participate in the public school system because yes, they don't have to pay the money, but the money they get, which is taxed from them, will make full finance the public school systems. And it's a good thing that everyone has have the same standard of living, so they're forced to lobby for the state if they want better services, for instance, if they want better educational systems, and that to lobby in the public system, not require them to use a privatized system. So I'm really uncertain what the benefit of privatization is under their side of the house. But there are key benefits to social welfare that are beneficial for both the short term and the long term in addressing inequality. First, in the short term, if we assume that this is financing things like dole-outs, soup kitchens, and feeding them in the short-term problems we have, we think this is a legitimately good thing because a lot of the problems of the poor right now are immediate in nature. Things like starvation, things like not having access to basic medication, things like not even being able to send their son to preschool or elementary school, that are basic problems can be solved by this policy. So we would suggest that the more immediate needs that exist in status quo today, which are unsolved by their model, because I'm uncertain how they plan to redistribute the wealth, is better solved when we have more money to help these poor individuals right now. But secondly, even from a long-term perspective, in terms of development, we think that developing the human capital of the poorest members of society is important, especially for developing countries. And the reason for this is a lot of the a lot of their industries is contingent on labor-intensive services. Things like manufacturing, things like resource extraction, and all that. It is important, therefore, to target the poorest members of society and give them basic services, i.e. things like basic education and literacy, things like protect their healthcare, because they're the labor force to prepare their economy to operate longer in the future. We would suggest in the long term, it is better off. But then I want to clarify things at the end of my speech. We would suggest that the money that we have is more by virtue of one, having more taxes because we're taxing not only the income, but the assets, but two, because these assets make money under our side of the house and are able to increase the amount of income we necessarily have. Their side of the house has to defend a world where you have less taxes to help the social welfare projects that exist. So yes, we can see that you'll still have some income redistribution under your side of the house, but not to the extent we're able to make services more efficient. One, because you have more money, but two, because by taxing assets, the social welfare projects that have just proven to be important are far more likely to be efficient under our side of the house. And the reason for this is, once you have access to land, once you have access to capital, the amount of expenditure that individuals have to give for basic services to the community diminish, because they no longer have to pay for the land, right? They no longer have to buy the land from private owners. They no longer have to build like specific buildings of infrastructure and be able to capture it from the rich individuals within society today. These are make it far more efficient for us to provide the social welfare services which are essential to the development of your state compared to their side of the house. So in conclusion, we would suggest that if their policy is to tax land and assets anyway, then we don't think there's a material difference. But if they concede that there's a material
Second next, please.
Obviously, there's a lot confusing happening in this debate. I just want to really slowly step through the first question, which is whether we should tax non-income assets in the same way that we tax income assets. The affirmative has not really argued that we should get rid of income tax. They've just argued that in addition to income tax, we should tax an array of other assets like land and savings. Thankfully, that memo has already been received by almost every country in the world, which engages in land taxes, wealth taxes, inheritance taxes, and the capital gains tax. The second affirmative speaker says those things are different. To tax people at the point at which they get benefit of that asset. For example, under the status quo, if you have a house, by that house is taxed at the house. So that means that, for example, if you live in a gentrified area, so the value of your house is rapidly increasing, but you're a low-income person, you don't have to pay more tax until you sell the house, and then suddenly have an influx of liquid assets, which you can use to pay off their tax obligations. Under the affirmative team's case, you would not be able to do that because you would be required to pay more tax on the value of the house, even though you are not getting the benefit of that value. So you would be forced to move out of a wealthier area, for example, as the value of that land is accumulating. Secondly, their side would lose far more room for tax evasion, because under the status quo, it's very easy to know what your tax obligations are on a piece of land. The value of the price at which that land is sold multiplied by the tax rate. Whereas the affirmative team's case requires land assessors to come along every year throughout that asset's lifetime to determine how that valuation has changed recently, or maybe every 5 years or 10 years. The reason why that's problematic is that it's much easier for people to deceive those assessors than it is to deceive the buyer who is receiving that land. So, for example, when asked, what improvements have you made on this land? You will say, I've made no improvements on this land, but you could not make that fraudulent claim if you were being taxed on the price that a buyer paid for that land. Thirdly, we should tax assets at different rates because they reflect differing levels of income. Most poor people have savings assets, most wealthier people have property assets. That is one of the main reasons why property taxes tend to be higher than taxes on savings. The second affirmative says, why do all assets need to be taxed at the same rate? Because it's your case. Like, literally, your case is, Zakat says all assets, including income, need a risk on irrigating your land, which would increase the value of your land and therefore increase your tax burden, but might not increase your income if you thought that you were certainly going to be hit with the tax bill, but you might not get any benefit out of it. Probably not. By contrast, under our side, you are taxed from the income you generate from your land. So you would think, I can irrigate my land or I can make improvements on my land because I know I will only be taxed insofar as that investment pays off and is reflected in further income that I have. Whereas their team gives you an incentive to keep land idle. Under our side, people are implicitly taxed if land is massively idle, in the sense that they're not using it and therefore it's valuable returns they're failing to capture. We think that that isn't the case. There's so much land that isn't being utilized under the status quo. And the affirmative team's line of logic for why the rich would keep their land idle, which is like, well, the less land there is on the market, the higher the value of land is going to be, assumes that there are people in society who own so much of the country that they can meaningfully affect real estate prices, which is true in almost no country. Like almost nowhere does an individual person own more than 1 or 2% of the total value of land. So it's not obvious why we would keep land idle, refuse to put it on the market to create scarcity, which is what the affirmative team's case is relying on. What have I shown you at the end of this issue? Even assuming the affirmative team's bizarre way of setting up this debate, we will have more money to give to children if we tax assets at the point of sale or tax assets to the point in which they generate real value rather than taxing anything in a non-discriminating way. Secondly, how is this proposal going to affect service delivery? Second affirmative speaker says there's no impact because everything a government does is social welfare. That is not the case, as the info slide to this topic makes clear. Social welfare is a subset of the broader cause of supporting the poor. For example, stimulus programs designed by the government to generate economic activity are never described as social welfare programs. Public infrastructure programs, like the building of roads, are never described as social infrastructure programs. Programs which fund universities and higher research are never described as social welfare programs. So none of those programs can be funded using this tax. We explain that that's very harmful. Firstly, it will reduce the amount of political capital that's available to gather this taxation revenue, because the reason why wealthy people are willing to support things like capital gains tax is because they also receive a benefit from government spending, whereas they wouldn't, since the affirmative team needs to get rid of all of their middle class welfare. Secondly, it allows the government to direct people in ways that are really valuable. Like, for example, having subsidies on sending your children to private schools or getting private healthcare saves the government money in the long run, because instead of going to a public hospital, you partially pay to go to a private hospital, so it's not an obligation that the government has. The reason why that's better is that for poor people who go to the public hospital, it is likely there are shorter waiting times when the government has set up an incentive system that encourages people to go elsewhere. Second affirmative speaker says, why help private healthcare? Well, because it generates those valuable savings that we're talking about in our case. But I also want to add two further reasons in substantive for why this would harm the amount of political capital for government programs. Firstly, it would reduce the rate at which the government is willing to tax assets, because it's very difficult under the status quo to make a feasible argument for my inheritance shouldn't be taxed at a high rate, which is why most countries are able to get away with having relatively high inheritance taxes. Whereas under the affirmative team's case, it's very easy for people to draw on sympathetic stories like, I'm being kicked out of my family house, even though none of the value has accumulated to me, just because it's a gentrifying area. And that will be used as an argument to reduce taxes, because it's those sorts of sympathetic cases we're drawing on. My second piece of substantive explains why the affirmative team can't rely on an alternative tax base like corporate tax or sales tax to fund those things I was talking about, like public infrastructure. Firstly, because corporate tax, for instance, is very volatile. Like, it can go down by 90% in the year of a recession, whereas often public infrastructure programs are very long-term, so it would harm our fiscal planning. And secondly, because taxes like sales taxes tend to be incredibly regressive, which is why we wouldn't like governments to be more reliant on those means of tax. And governments will be more reliant on those means of tax if they are told that the income tax that they're able to generate is constrained hugely by this model, as it will be. The affirmative team has not argued for the topic. Even if they have argued for a form of taxation so foolish that no government would ever adopt it, and that's why we oppose.
All right, thank you very much for that speech. Third F.
I'm going to be talking about two things in this speech. Which side uses this tax more strategically and in a way that is sustainable to help the rest of society, not just the poor? And secondly, in which world are we better able to use this targetively and use it as a measure to help everybody in society and not simply these individuals, right? But let's go to a few rebuttals first to the previous speaker, because I think if there is a team in this round that hasn't been reading the info slide, it's definitely negative. Because the claims that they've been pushing so far have been things like, oh, you're only limiting things, for example, to social welfare programs. It says in the info slide that it's exclusively social welfare programs. The info slide specifically says that it can be pooled to fund social welfare programs. It doesn't say it exclusively has to be these things, but even if that is the case, Nacho engaged with this anyway. And he told you that we think that the needs of the poor are inherently more immediate, that the needs of the poor are things that have to be addressed right now. And that's why we need things like liquid funds to be able to fund these kinds of things, right? Because the alternatives they gave to us were things like, well, we need to subsidize things like private healthcare or make those things available so that public healthcare is also improved for the poor. We think this is something that takes place over years and years, right? It takes place over decades even. But the things that we need right now to solve inequality, or at least to lessen inequality, are the immediate needs of the poor. Things like, yes, soup kitchens, yes, things like having social welfare programs that cater to those immediate needs, and having things like paying welfare to these families. We think those are the immediate needs we have to address. But then from the previous speaker, he told us that, well, we'd rather tax at the point of transfer and not continuously, because it's only at that point of transfer that you receive that benefit. But we tell you that, and we tell you it's perfectly fine, right, if you don't receive that benefit, because the point of our house that we've been trying to push is that we want to force people to sell things that they cannot afford to maintain. We want to make people sell these things that are continually being idle and continually not being used for the betterment of the nation as a whole. Because in a time in which inequality is one of the most pressing issues of our time that needs to be addressed and needs to be stopped being pushed under the rug, we think we're fine with making people uncomfortable, taking away their home, taking away something that has sentimental value to them. Because these things do not have the same importance nor the same impact to the most vulnerable. And we think they are the ones we need to provide for in this debate. Then he told us, well, it's easier to evade assets when it's an issue, when it's like this kind of zakat tax, right? That simply you can just fool them every year. And he just said this very deliberately. But I think it's much, much harder to fool different auditors or different people every year, as opposed to only at the point of transaction or only at the point of transfer will you be checked and will you be audited. We think it's a much more difficult, and in fact, you have more hoops to jump through if you want to deceive people. We think that's a benefit on our side, because now the poor cannot, the rich cannot simply continue relying on these loopholes or relying on deception to evade these kinds of taxes, right? At the very least, even if they still get away with it, they have to work harder to do so. We think that's a value in itself. But then he gave us this really strange example of, would you choose to develop your land if it increases your tax burden? And he gave us this example of, you won't irrigate your land because it'll be more of a risk to invest in that, right? And you're still absorbing a higher tax burden. We say you will irrigate your land because you don't want your land to depreciate, or you don't want the soil in your land, for example, to degrade. That means the inherent value of your land will degrade. And we think that's a harm that they will have to absorb and that will be difficult to get back, right? So we think that to begin with, you will have the incentive to develop these things, or at the very least maintain them in that context, right? And then he told us that, well, there isn't a single country where individuals own enough land to sway prices. We're not talking about one or two individuals, right? We're talking about the upper class, a group of people, the landed elite. And it might not be as common in Australia, but in the Philippines, I promise you, it's really quite common. We see that these people have the capacity to limit the amounts of land that are available to the poor. That means that when there's less land available to people, or at least or real estate prices, for example, are higher in that area, that means that the poor have less capacity to be included in those kinds of economic decisions or have access to those economic resources. But let's go to the issues, right? Which side do we think is more strategic in the way that we use tax? And secondly, where is it more sustainable? Because coming from the first speaker, she just talked to us about how, well, you have to argue for income tax for all, or higher income tax for all. We told you this is perfectly fine, because we think the harm, if we do not do so, is much graver and is worth it, and is not worth it, right? We told you, she just kept telling us that, for example, we already have higher taxes for land and estate tax. But we tell you that if it is true that these taxes are so high, and we are simply going to have a similarly high tax, we think that the political capital issue would probably just be the same, right? To either side, it is still something that people don't want to do. It is still a cut out of your paycheck or a cut out of your assets. So we don't think they really get to say that, well, it'll take so much more political capital, it'll hurt your political capital so much more. But then she told us that, well, it's counter to the principles of progressive taxation because you're only redistributing this back to the poor. And she told you that it's unjust because the market value doesn't reflect the real life value it gives you or the benefit. But Nacho already responded to this by saying, if you just simply compare the actors in the debate, we think it's quite clear who needs that money more. And it's quite clear to whom that impact will be greater. We think that you're right to say having the ancestral home that you've always had is not as absolute a right as it is, for example, to have access to food, to have access to food stamps, or to have access to basic healthcare. We think that those things are more immediate needs that need to be catered to, that will not happen on their side of the house if we continue to rely on, well, we have overreaching programs that will benefit everybody, not necessarily just the poor. But again, who is the party or who is the actor that needs that help the most? We think that analysis was absent from them, right? But then they told us that we can't say reasonably that things like roads or all of these things are social welfare. We think that these things can reasonably count under social welfare, or infrastructure for the poor, for example, or infrastructure like roads in depressed communities does count as social welfare, because that does increase your capacity to get goods and services. You can travel to places where you can get work, for example. And if it's in a place that is specifically more depressed or economically disadvantaged, we think that is a form of social welfare, right? Just because it is a road and a lot of people use it, that doesn't mean it's only it doesn't benefit the poor as well. But we think that when we're talking about which model is more sustainable and where we're better able to actually redistribute this in a meaningful way, we told you why the poor are the most important actor in this debate. We told you that they are the labor force, for example, or they are the people that if they get sick or if they don't have money, if they don't have food, that means they don't go to work. That means they cannot generate productive outcome. But even if that isn't the most important thing, even if it's not about being a productive member of society, even just as human beings, having the capacity to access their basic rights is something we think is important, and it's something that the government should cater to as well. But lastly, the most important thing we told you was that these assets, the way that they're so intrinsically different from income, is that they have the capacity to continually generate income or continually generate money, right? In the same way, in a different way, like the income tax on their side isn't really necessarily going to become productive in itself unless you invest it in something else. But when we seize assets themselves, like land or like your house, for example, the state has the incentive to develop and maximize those things. And we think it's in this world where we can maximize or accumulate more political capital, because it's when the state develops, for example, these swaths of land that they have seized, that people will see that there is a benefit and that the people can be included in these kinds of economic outcomes. We think it's there that these assets are fully maximized by the actor that has the best incentive to maximize them, not just simply languishing away, not just simply wasting away, simply because the rich feel that they're continually insecure, that they continually have something to lose. We think the ones who have the most to lose are definitely the poor, and that's why they should be the most important actor in this debate. Thanks.
Thank you. So next.
If this affirmative team has a problem with the rich in society owning multiple properties and not renting them out at a reasonable price, that is a very good reason for taxing people who own multiple properties and do not rent them out at a reasonable price. That's not what this affirmative team is doing. This affirmative team is at best doing that, but also saying that a retiree who doesn't earn any money anymore but has worked for 50 years to pay off the family home that they now live in alone should have that asset counted equally to a 25-year-old who's got an up-and-coming income to the same level as that property price. That is immoral, that is ridiculous, and that is exactly the kind of story that is going to be put on the front page of every newspaper to suggest that the tax rate should be put down for everybody in a way that guts the social welfare programs that this affirmative team cares about. I'm going to ask 3 questions in this speech. First is, what does this do to social welfare programs, and should we prioritise these social welfare programs? Second, is this form of taxation fair? And third, does this form of taxation get us more money? First, on social welfare problems. I'm not going to spend long on this, but on a technical reading of the topic, the type of tax system we are talking about is one which helps the poor, and as an addition, can be used for social welfare programs in order to make sure that the state functions, since you need some sort of collective action to, for instance, give out welfare. It is not, at the very worst case scenario for us, it is still not giving money to companies. It's not giving tax breaks to rich people to incentivize them to do certain things. It's probably not building infrastructure programs in places that are particularly well off. The affirmative team here wants to say, well, even when we decide to have this debate at third affirmative, we still think that the poor should be the most important, which mistakes the material which we've given you from first, which isn't that we care about rich people getting good infrastructure or about these certain things happening. It's that often the way to make sure that people who are less well off in society live in a society which is good for them is to make sure that every element of society is doing things in a way that's socially beneficial. We give you the example of the fact that you might want to incentivize rich people to go to private schools. The affirmative affirmative team at best here rebuts the example, but doesn't rebut the mechanism, which is at times you need to affect the behaviour of people who are well off so that they don't screw over people who are poorly off. So even if you believe that you should have a public education system, the affirmative team has done nothing to prove that their model facilitates that. What are the things that, but what are the other things that we give you that they don't respond to at all? We say that you might want to do things like giving out a stimulus package to people who are very well off on the brink of a financial crisis, or helping medical research. This obviously is directly money in the pockets of the rich, but it has a far greater influence on the people who are worse off. For example, if the GFC hits a country particularly hard, the business owners might be a bit sad, but the people living on minimum wage who are laid off for years are significantly worse off, and that is a reason why you would give a stimulus package to the rich. Similarly, it is in a government's incentive for poor people to make sure that universities patent the drugs and then can sell them at a reasonable price to those who are not well off, rather than not funding universities or not funding medical research and making sure that it is in the pockets of pharmaceutical companies who will go on to screw over those poor people. It is not that we didn't care about poor people or contested that they were important. It was that we completely denied that soup kitchens were the way that we were going to make sure that inequality was no longer a thing. That is why you needed programs which were not just social welfare programs. Okay, onto the second issue, which is where the majority of this debate happened, on the form of tax. Firstly, on whether or not it's fair. The first thing I want to establish, as we've said down the bench, is that a lot of the rhetoric that the affirmative team has been using here is not for the model which they are actually defending. Things like land tax, which are taxed specifically on where your land is, or things like inherited tax, or things like stamp duty, which is a tax which happens at the point of transaction for a property, are things that we can support. They support the fact that you own this property being a constant addition to your assets and a constant addition to what is now an income tax across your life. What are the two distinctions that we make here that you ought consider and this affirmative team cannot consider? The first thing is it's relevant how you get that property. So we think that someone who inherits their house from their rich parents when they're young, or get it given as a gift by their rich parents when they are young, are not as sympathetic and ought be taxed more than somebody who works hard to own that house and reaps the reward of that when they're 65 or when they're 50 or when they have or when they're able to become mobile in whatever way. I assume the affirmative team agrees with this, since the vast majority of their case has been built around these land magnates who have their wealth accumulated for them. You are saying that they ought be taxed the same as someone who's worked really hard and got a lucky break. The second thing that you ought consider, though, on a principled level is what you gain. So as we said, you should not punish a poor person who happens to buy a house in an area that then gentrifies, because they don't gain much from that gentrification. You punish them because when they spend $20,000 on their first flat, suddenly they're now in like $1 million property that they have to sell off. They lose any benefits or social mobility they might have gotten from being lucky about making that investment, and you punish them in a way which is particularly unfair. At Third Affirmative, we hear the best defence of this principle, which is the idea that we don't want people using property they cannot afford. The problem is, though, under this affirmative team, it is only the ultra-rich that can afford property. Because if you've spent your life paying off a debt for a $100,000 flat, and by the time you do it, you do not have an income, this tax will bankrupt you and you will have to sell off that house. By contrast, it is the rich people that have bank accounts to spare that are able to live in their family home because they do have the liquid assets to deal with the fact that they have this house, or they are, for instance, willing to borrow money in a way which is in a way which is useful. This is absolutely abhorrent. Let's look, though, at the usefulness of this getting money. So what gets you more money? The problem we point out is not one of political capital, which is what the affirmative team wants to characterise, but one of practicality. If you earn $100,000 a year and you own an $100,000 house, under our system, you would only pay $50,000 of tax in a 50% income situation, and you would still be able to buy groceries. If they want to set the tax at 50%, though, that person will have no money for groceries because they will spend all of their income on paying this tax, because the rest of it will be in a property. That is why either they destroy the economy and mean that no one who is not ultra rich can own a house, or they have to make it lower because otherwise otherwise it will be a disaster. And then you also need to think about the narratives of this, because they don't get to set the rate, they get to set the model. And when you're talking about the rate in this system, we think that people absolutely are not going to want to pay more money. At the point you have less money, it's also important to note that the alternatives become significantly worse. As we explained at second, consumption tax is hugely regressive because it takes out a larger portion of your income if you're poor than if you're rich, and corporate tax is very volatile. Let's finally look though at the problem this affirmative team diagnoses about people using their assets effectively. This is a case for punishing people who hoard land they do not need. This is not a case for making sure that everyone is done on their house. For instance, we think that if you want to break up the property markets, it might make sense to encourage first home buyers to buy a house and discourage people from buying investment properties. They cannot do that. They actually make it so that it is a risk to improve your land, because if you do not get profit from that, you're still paying the base amount rather than incentivizing that. This is a terrible idea, not just for the economy broadly, but for the people who the affirmative team care about most, which is the worse off, and that is why we oppose.
Thank you for that speech. Nice reply.
There were two questions in this debate. Firstly, which side taxes people in a fairer way? And secondly, how do we best direct social welfare? Starting with the first question, because it's on this issue that the negative team, hands down, far and away, has won this debate. The affirmative team clearly cannot get away with this issue because they have just described land and wealth taxes, which are taxes that most countries already have. We question them explicitly at all three speakers. In what respect would zakat differ? Second and third, they try to minimise the debate to a very technocratic dispute about whether assets should be taxed at the point of sale or over the lifetime of the asset. But we point out that land taxes and wealth taxes already achieve that explicit purpose. So there is no clear benefit that the affirmative team can claim. So when they claim benefits like more money to feed the poor, the mechanism that relies on of a more effective taxation system has never been established. We very generously say that even if the question is point of sale versus lifetime of asset taxation, point of sale taxation is preferable. Firstly, we say that the way in which property is gained is relevant. In our first speaker's speech, we said that financial security assets, which have less benefit to society, should be taxed in a different way to the income an individual receives from their hard work at a business. In second, and then again at third, we point out that assets individuals inherit should be taxed in a different way to assets which individuals work hard for. There was no response to the affirmative team to either line of argument. Secondly, we said that the way in which people gain from those assets is relevant. For example, we said it would be morally wrong to push poor people out of gentrifying areas and to lose their local job and local social connections because property values are climbing. The third affirmative speaker's response, that people shouldn't be able to use idle land, misunderstood the argument we were making in all three speakers. The land wasn't idle, it was still being lived in. The question was, should a poor person be forced to leave because they can't pay the tax burden now since they haven't sold off their asset? And the affirmative team never really answered that question. Lastly, we said that their tax encouraged more land to be idle, which was the entire premise of the affirmative team's case. The third affirmative speaker's response to this proves exactly the opposite of her intention. Her response, which was, you wouldn't want land to degrade, mistakes that is the very incentive that the affirmative team's case gives property owners, since the lower the value of the land, the lower the rate of taxation that will be levied on it. Whereas our case said that it was more likely people would have an incentive to improve their land when they could take a risk on improvement, knowing that they could only be taxed if they generated income because of that. At the end of this issue, what's clear is that our system of taxation is fairer, and most importantly, it's more likely that people would be willing to vote for high taxation when they do not see taxation as forcing people out of their family homes or forcing people to leave assets to go to ground. That was why if we wanted more money for social welfare programs, the negative team had to win this debate because we were not putting taxation in those most unsympathetic ways. Secondly, how do we best direct social welfare? We pointed out that the inherent part of this topic was that it was involved in programs that are aimed at the poor, specifically social welfare programs. Our case wasn't that the poor are less important. We said that programs which are initially directed at wealthier people can have important benefits for the poor. Firstly, there are flow-on benefits to, for instance, roads in wealthier areas, which allow poorer people to access those areas and jobs there. Secondly, we said that it saves the government money when it directed wealthier people towards private services that reduce the burden on public services. Thirdly, we said it created more room for higher rates of taxation when people understood that everyone got the benefit from that taxation, rather than it just going to the poorest people in society. At the end of this debate, at very best, the affirmative team has described an ideal system of taxation that exists and most countries already use. We have generously explained why that system of taxation would mean that there is less money available for the government to direct to programs that both sides want. And that is why we've won the debate.
Thank you very much for that speech. Affirmative reply.
Like in this debate, can't run a case saying that our policy is not different from status quo, yet list all the harms of our policy that make it terrible. Because we would suggest that there are material differences of our policy from status quo that you have pointed out from the start. I just want to clarify a few things. We said we are not against capital gains tax and estate tax and inheritance tax. We suggest that this is a different tax from the tax we are proposing on right now. Because we don't just want to tax sales at the point of transfer or tax properties at the sale point of transfer, but rather we want to tax the constant ownership of that land or ownership of this asset, because we think that the state has a stake in that ownership by virtue of you protecting that ownership, giving you the security, the protection you need to have the assets to begin with, which is the principle coming from first AF, unresponded to by everyone at NEG. But secondly, they said that it's unfair because we don't defend poor people who live in a rich house and who are now forced to leave. We said that these individuals, the upper middle class and middle class individuals who might earn less money, are still better off in society than people who can't even afford a house. And it's fine. And if they're forced out of the house they can't pay for coming from third half, because that's better for the rest of society because you're able to redistribute wealth to people who can better maximize it. So if they're only stakeholders, poor individuals who can't afford the houses, we're perfectly fine with taking a trade-off. That means for the vast majority of poor people who can't even afford houses to begin with, we're able to give them that property. So the question of this debate then becomes, which side of the house has A, more money to help the poor, but 2, provide better services to help the poor? First, which side of the house has more money? We said that our taxes increase because now we can tax a confluence of factors and not just income tax. Their response was to say that the right-wing backlash will propel these taxes to be low. I'm uncertain how this is true, since they also have taxes on property and there's a house. But even if we assume it is true, our arguments are preemptive from the start. We said that because you tax more things, even if you have a lower tax, you balances out. But secondly, we said that assets, unlike raw income, makes money over time and therefore can compensate for the lower income tax. We also said that owning assets makes providing social welfare cheaper because you own the land and you don't have to buy the land. You own the infrastructure already and you don't have to buy the infrastructure. That is why, even if you have lower tax rates, we still have more money to spend because it's more efficiently used by taxing assets and not just income. So we would suggest that our state is more equipped to help the poor members in society because it has greater capacity to do so. The next thing they then said was, but even if they have more money, social welfare is a bad thing. We already pointed out that just because the info side says you can use it on social welfare doesn't mean it's always used on social welfare. But we were very generous with that. We said, even if this is about social welfare projects exclusively, that is a great thing Because all the benefits of stimulus packages, improving privatized healthcare, is nothing compared to, as I point out, the immediate needs of the poor right now that need to be taken care of. Things like soup kitchens feeding them for starvation, things like giving them basic access to healthcare, and all of these problems that will not be solved, or uncertain whether it will solve them with the stimulus packages that help the rich under their set of house. So we suggest that social welfare is better at catering to them in the short term. But even if we contextualize this debate or assess this debate in the long term, I gave out analysis in my speeches on responding to them about how it is important to provide social welfare to develop the low-skilled labor of developing countries, because that is how you get the development you need for the vast majority of economies that they want to defend under their house. That is why social welfare is a good thing. The last ditch they said was, well, people won't invest in these houses because they fear being taxed. We said that they will be taxed at all times. That's why the only incentive for them to protect themselves and protect their wealth is to continue increasing that wealth, because that's the only time for them to be able to be protected. Their side has no incentive for them to innovate because they know that they'll be taxed during income and not during the constant process to which you are taxed. The problem of this debate is not about rich people who own houses. The problem of this debate is poor people who can't even afford houses to begin with. And these are the people protected by affirmative, unresponded to, coming from negative. We're very proud of this. Thank you.
All right, I would like to invite the generous humans to cross floor and shake hands with each other. I will bring them when ready.
Thank you.
Shut up. Take it out.